Good morning. It's Mamaw Yates, and today I'm going to continue our discussion on Task 4 by looking very closely at how to write Prompt 1. Now, Prompt 1 is scored with Rubric 16, and this is where you analyze whole class understandings. If you don't believe that your EdTPA has a Task 4, you might be right, because Task 4 is only for those people who are completing the Elementary Combined Handbook. So let's take a look. First of all, to get a good understanding about what you need to write, it's important that you understand what mathematical understandings you need to be thinking about. Now, when we teach math, we think about three things. We think about conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, and problem solving. Sometimes the problem is for a lot of people, it's learning what these things are. So we're going to look at that first of all. So these are the mathematical understandings that we mostly deal with in an elementary setting. And there's three of them. There's conceptual understanding, there's procedural fluency, and then we combine mathematical reasoning and problem solving in the EdTPA. There's lots of material out there that you can Google and read about that give much better definitions than what I'm going to give you because those are written by mathematicians, which I'm not. I'm not a mathematician. However, I can give you a practical idea about what these mean just by giving you an example. Let's say, for instance, that you teach first grade or kindergarten and you're going to introduce addition, and your standard is about addition. So when we look at that, the concept that you want the students to understand, what is that concept? So in the concept of addition, we introduce it by showing that you have two apples and two oranges, or maybe two apples and two apples. And when you put those together, you have one, two, three, four. That's the concept of addition. And in order for any of it to make sense, for them really to be able to go forward in any practical way, they need to get that concept. So the conceptual understanding is very important in math, and we can't just go straight to the algorithm. So the algorithm has to come after you have a really good understanding of the concept. And we refer to this as procedural fluency. Just like we want to be fluent in any language, and we want to be fluent in reading, we also want to be fluent in math. So basically, this is how can a student very quickly find and use the strategy necessary to solve a problem. So now they're not going to pulling out two apples and two oranges, putting them together and going 1, 2, 3, 4. They can actually write the algorithm 2 plus 2 equals 4. So this is what we refer to as procedural fluency. So mathematical reasoning is a very important component because that keeps us from making really bad mistakes. So let's say, for instance, that a student was using a calculator and they put in a 2 and they put in a 2 and they hit equal, and of course it's going to come up with 22 because they forgot to put in the plus sign. Or maybe they accidentally put in 2 plus 2 equals, and they come up with 24. With a good mathematical reasoning, they're going to see that it's not reasonable in their mind that 2 and 2 is going to equal 22. That's all that means. Math has to make sense, and it keeps us from making big mistakes. Um, Problem solving is when they use the concepts and the procedure in order to solve problems in real life. Now, as I said, a little caveat there, I am not a math educator per se, and so you just really need to have a working definition. But if you want to look at these more carefully, there's lots of good stuff out there on the internet. So at this point, by the time you're writing your task for commentary, you will have selected a class, and This can be a different class than the class you used in the task 1, 2, and 3. You need to have a minimum of 4 students. If you are just describing the instruction of that group, that can be considered the whole class for your context for learning for math. But if you are teaching the whole class, then your context for learning should reflect that whole class. So there is a context for learning that you're going to complete. Then there's a learning segment. Now, this learning segment you're going to describe, and you're going to describe it in this right here. And this is one of your templates that's provided. But that learning segment is going to be 3 to 5 consecutive lessons, and it can be taught by you or it can be taught by your mentor. The important thing is that the central focus and the objectives include support for the students in understanding these mathematical understandings. So these consecutive lessons need to include conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, and problem solving. And it is important and cannot be stated enough that you need to choose a learning segment where the students are learning new mathematical material. So this can't be a remedial lesson. It can't be a reteach or a re-engagement or anything because this is all of task 4 is about something getting taught for the first time, you assessing how they did, and then teaching a re-engagement lesson. So you're going to complete this. It's going to have your central focus, your standards, your objectives for each lesson, instructional strategies, and then your formative assessments. Now, the formative assessment is I would think, one of the most integral parts, that and the evaluation criteria that you're going to have for task 4. Very important that you have a good formative assessment. And formative, I think there's a lot of confusion between the terms formative and summative. I think people think summative means, um, a test or a quiz, and it can be, but normally a summative is a big thing. It's a benchmark. It's like a unit test. It's a semester. It's a unit. It's a bigger thing. Formative is any assessment that you're going to give the students to see how they did, to see what you need to do next. That's what formative is. And those can be informal and they can be formal. But this formative assessment that either your mentor or you are going to create is going to be the work of individuals. It can't be a group assessment. It needs to be just one for each child. And it needs to include these mathematical understandings of conceptual understanding, procedural fluency or computation, mathematical reasoning, problem solving. And so you're going to submit a blank copy of that formative assessment, and that's going to be your artifact, Part C, and it's labeled Part C, Mathematics Chosen Formative Assessment. Then you need to develop evaluation criteria. Now, just as a reminder, the assessment is the quiz or the test or whatever that you're giving the students. Evaluation criteria is the tool that you're going to create that helps you evaluate how well the students did on the assessment. Often it looks like a rubric like this. So here you can see this is from my friend Nikki, who has the Facebook group EdTPA All Day, and she's allowed me to use this. Thank you, Nikki. And she's made her evaluation criteria. She's made her evaluation criteria based on procedural fluency, conceptual understanding, and problem solving. She's thought about what it's going to look like for each of them to meet the criteria, what it would look like if they're progressing toward it or a beginner. She's indicated the objectives up here that she's assessing, and then she indicates which of these mathematical understandings is aligned with which objective and which question number. Very good job on that. So again, in this part of the assessment, of your task 4, you're going to have a blank copy of your formative assessment, and that's going to be your part C in your artifact chart, and then your evaluation criteria, which is part D. Now, once you have those things, you're ready to write. You've given the assessment to the students, and you're sitting, you're looking at it. So now you're ready to write, and the first question you have to write is prompt 1A, which is identify the specific learning objectives measured by the formative assessment you chose for analysis. So identify. Identify, whenever you see identify, just say praise the Lord, hallelujah, because it's going to be easy. It's just really a matter of just stating what they are. And here you can see objective 1 is stated. This is Nikki's work again. Thank you, Nikki. Objective 2 is stated. And so just that's just very quickly. So these are the objectives that are assessed in the formative assessment. So you don't have to list all of the objectives that are taught in that original lesson, just the ones in that. Now, the next one is provide a graphic, chart or table, or narrative that summarizes student learning for the whole class. Now remember, your whole class might be 20 kids, 30 kids, or just 4 if you were given a small group. But you're going to be summarizing all of the student work in a graph or a table. Now it says chart or table or narrative. My feeling is to do both. I think you should provide a good graph or chart because that's going to help you draw conclusions, and it's going to give you a reference point for when you do your writing. And a narrative to explain the chart to the score. So you want to make sure that you're summarizing your student learning for all of the evaluation criteria that you submitted for that artifact, Part D. Here's some examples. This is Nikki's chart that she made. You can see she's got her objectives up here. These are the objectives from the formative assessment. She's made a chart instead of a graph. She's got her focus learners that she chose here. She's indicated which ones are struggling. She's got the mathematical understandings and how well they did, and she's got some notes at the bottom. There's this is a pie chart you could make. You could make a pie chart for procedural fluency, conceptual understanding, and mathematical reasoning. This is a really quick way for you to be able to say 61% of my class was proficient in procedural fluency, compared to 81% of my class that understood the concept. But mathematical reasoning, they were 46% proficient. So there you can see, you can start seeing some trends. Here's another one. This person is showing mastery in green, satisfactory work in yellow. And she's done it by question, and then she's also put those questions and objectives together with whatever is the mathematical understanding. She also includes this effort and show your work. That's really not necessary here because it's not what we're talking about. Showing your work and effort are not objectives that you would be assessing. But it's okay that she included it. It didn't hurt her score. It's just not necessary. I would stick to just these 3 things. And then, of course, a summary that explains it is a really good idea. I would make it a short summary because you're going to do a lot more explanation in the next part. Now, making a graph. Right now, if I were you, I'd get out my phone and I would take a picture of this screen where I would, well, don't have my phone handy, but I would take a picture of this screen right here so that you can remember to look up Hannah Alexis Hess and look for her video on making graphs for your EdTPA using Google Sheets. Now, she made this for Task 3, Part 1B, but it's the exact same skill that you need to have for Task 4, Prompt 1B. So task 4, prompt 1B. So she goes through in 21 minutes. She's going to make you an expert on how to make these wonderful graphs. This is a really good video. Best one I've seen out there. Okay. Now here's the question you've got to answer. And most of the points that come from Rubric 16 come from this answer. Now when we look at Rubric 16 is scored from prompt 1. They also will look at your formative assessment and your evaluation criteria, but they're getting most of their information, the primary source is from your response to prompt 1. So the first thing, a score starts at level 3, and they identify. Here you want to make sure that you're identifying what students did right and wrong, and you want to make sure that you're doing this in terms of thinking of conceptual understanding and procedural fluency or mathematical reasoning and problem solving. So you don't have to do all 3 in your analysis, but you have to have conceptual understanding and you have to have one of these other 2. Now note that it is possible to make a 1 or a 2. It's an automatic 1 if your evaluation criteria, your objectives, and are not aligned. So you need to make sure that there's alignment. You also want to make sure that you don't have any inaccuracies. So don't go around saying that 2 plus 2 equals 22, please, because that would be a content inaccuracy. Then we're going to have for a 4, if you meet a 3, then a 4 is going to be where you're connecting patterns. So you've looked at these results and now you've said, aha, I've got some learning patterns here. And you've connected those patterns to conceptual understanding and one of these 2, procedural fluency or mathematical reasoning and problem solving. Now, I think it's really hard to get a 5, and very few people actually get 5s on any of the rubrics. They're rare, and as they should be, because it does indicate someone who is at the level of an experienced teacher. So a candidate describes the relationship between or among the patterns of learning. So not only would you identify and explicitly explain your patterns of learning, connecting them to conceptual understanding, you would start to talk about how your different patterns of learning came in together, how they all related to each other. And that would be a level 5 on this response. Now, when you write this response, it's always good to make a word bank. I'm pulling this word bank from the question and from the rubric itself. So you want to talk about your whole class, right, wrong, evidence, graph. That's when you're going to be referring to your graph. You are going to be using the terms conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, or problem solving. You need to use the term patterns of learning. Use the word connection, relationship. Here's a sentence stem. As you can see in my graph, that's a really good sentence stem that you need to make sure is included in your writing. And you also want to include percentages in your writing. And if not percentages, you need to be using numbers. 3 out of 20 of my students, 2 out of 5. So even if you don't do a percentage, give us a number. If you can give a number like that, you can definitely do a percentage. So use percentages in your writing so that we're getting the evidence to support your assertions. So next we have, this is from your Understanding Rubric Level Progressions. This is your URLP, as I like to call it. So you want to make sure that you have these things, a narrative or a graphic that highlights the differences in mathematical performance for the whole class. We'll make sure it's aligned with evaluative criteria. And it shows what the students did right and wrong within the whole class. And the right and wrong needs to be related to conceptual understanding and procedural fluency or mathematical reasoning problem solving. Here's an example. The URLP has lots of examples. uh, and that kind of gives you an example response. I really don't like this example because honestly, it's not long enough. The If you only wrote this amount for a level in your prompt 1C, I can guarantee you would not get a 3. So don't look at this, look at the content of it, but I don't really actually think this is a very good example. Above a 3, that would be where you are able to identify patterns of learning. For example, you might say, my students were able to, um, my students did better at procedural fluency than they did at conceptual understanding. My students understood the concept but struggled with the procedure. That's a learning pattern, but you'll want to be more specific, going by your own central focus and your objectives as to what those were. You want to relate those learning patterns to conceptual understanding and one of those other two, procedural fluency or mathematical reasoning. You're going to refer to the summary of your student learning. So you're going to be constantly referencing your graph. Now, how do we distinguish a 4 from a 3? So at a level 4, the analysis identifies a direct relationship between the patterns of learning with those mathematical understandings. And it goes beyond listing strengths and errors. It gives an explanation of the patterns in relation to those mathematical understandings. And there's specific evidence from the summary that's used to demonstrate the whole class patterns. So saying something like, as you can see from my graph, and then you're referring to that evidence. All right, so in writing your response, you're going to need to establish these things in your response. You want to make sure that you have identified and described pattern of learning that's relative to each of the mathematical understandings. Now, I know the rubric says or, that you only have to do 2, but I'd like for you to strive to do all 3 because I really think that's what's going to work best for you. You want to explain how the assessment and evaluative criteria gave you data on that mathematical understanding. You want to explain the data that you collected and how it demonstrated a pattern of learning. How did you look at that data and come up with a pattern? You want to cite the evidence for that pattern and make a connection between the pattern of learning and the next one that you're getting ready to discuss. So this is how I would do it. I would, here's the prompt. Using examples from the summary chart, discuss the patterns of learning across the whole class relative to those mathematical understandings. Okay, start with conceptual understanding. You're going to write at least 3 paragraphs. Your first paragraph is going to be about a learning pattern that you found that's related to conceptual understanding. You're going to start with this because you have to do conceptual understanding. That one's not at all negotiable. You have to do that. So describe the concepts. First of all, describe what concepts were assessed in your formative assessment. And make sure you've told what parts of your assessment and the evaluative criteria that helped you understand how the students performed on the concept. Then identify the pattern of learning that had to do with the conceptual understanding that you found and explain it. When considering this conceptual understanding, think about what did the students get right, and then cite the evidence from your chart to support your claim. What did the students get wrong? Cite the evidence from your chart to support your claim. And then conclude the paragraph, wrap it up by restating that the pattern of learning is relative, restating how the pattern of learning is relative to conceptual understanding. And then hopefully, if you can somehow make a connection between the pattern learning that you've just finished discussing with the next one that you're going to discuss, and I think that's how you get a 5. So your next paragraph could be on procedural fluency. Now, I don't think that the order of the next two paragraphs matter. I do think that your first paragraph does need to be on conceptual understanding because, again, that's definitely the one that they're looking for. So you're going to describe the procedural fluency. This is concepts, but it should be procedure. So describe the procedure or the computation that was assessed in the assessment, the parts that helped you understand how the students performed on procedural fluency. Then you're going to identify and explain the pattern of learning that you found related to procedural fluency. And then when considering it, what did they get right? Cite the evidence. What did they get wrong? Cite the evidence. Conclude your paragraph by restating that pattern of learning relative in procedural fluency. Just a good summation of your major points in your paragraph. And if you can come up with a transitional sentence that makes a connection between that pattern of learning and conceptual understanding with problem solving or mathematical reasoning. So basically what you're wanting to do is that you're wanting to connect this pattern of learning to the other patterns of learning so that it all kind of comes together and congeals. Your third paragraph, this is going to be a learning pattern that you found that's relative to mathematical reasoning and problem solving. Again, you're going to describe the problem solving concepts, mathematical reasoning that's assessed in the assessment, what parts help you understand how students performed on mathematical reasoning or problem solving, identify and explain the pattern of learning to that. I'm tired of saying it. When considering this mathematical reasoning or problem solving, what they get right, cite the evidence, what they get wrong, cite the evidence. Then conclude by restating your major points and hopefully making connection between this um, pattern of learning with the others. Here's an example again. This is taken from Nikki's sample that she shared with me. And let's see how it hits some of these things. So first of all, you want to make sure that you're identifying and explaining a learning pattern and connecting it to one of the mathematical understandings. You want to make sure that you're providing evidence to support the claim and that you've really attempted to analyze and make connections. So here you can see she says the first pattern of learning I saw across the whole class was a lack of conceptual understanding. Here she's attempting to identify and explain the connections of patterns of learning to conceptual understanding. Next, she provides the evidence of what they got right and what they got wrong. I'm happy to see that she's using quantitative evidence here. And so this really helps her get a 3 by talking about both what they got right and wrong. And then she's worked on trying to get to a level 5 by describing a relationship between these patterns of learning. So in the rest of this, she's doing a discussion about conceptual understanding and mathematical reasoning and problem solving process. And she says here, displayed a lack of conceptual understanding involved to think through a word problem. So you can see she's working very hard to describe this relationship among the patterns of learning. She's done a fine job on this. And you can too. You can do this. Take your time. Make sure that you're reading your handbook and you're making good choices. Watch the videos. And most of the time, we learn things best on by finding them out on our own. So where it's easy to ask questions, and you certainly should be asking questions, looking for that answer yourself in your handbook often can be the best way for you to be successful. Good luck on your EdTPA, and I'm sure you're going to do great.